It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. Our guest today is the acclaimed historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and perhaps the most widely read scholar of the American presidency. She is the author of 6 best-selling books, most recently The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and the Golden Age of Journalism. Her biography of Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals, was the basis for Steven Spielberg's Academy Award-winning film Lincoln. She was awarded the Pulitzer for No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Home Front in World War II. Her other books examine President Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. It's a pleasure, and we're lucky to get to have an hour of your time.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
There is oftentimes a sense around history, and oftentimes even historians, I think, project this, but a sense of inevitability about history, that the things that happen were just going to happen, almost a sense of predestination, as opposed to what your books really do capture is that these are human beings with all sorts of frailties, and they make good decisions and bad decisions.
FDR once said, problems created by men can be solved by men. You know, we sometimes think that things are either predestined or too messed together to unravel in a certain sense. But when you think about the periods of time that I've studied have often been crisis periods. And there is something, as you know as an historian, where a crisis gives freedom for the leader to do things that might not otherwise happen. Obviously, if Lincoln had been president in the 1830s or 1840s, before the anti-slavery movement had reached its peak as it did before the South seceded, he might not have been able to do what he was able to do. Similarly, if FDR had not come on the scene at the time of the Depression, all of the legislation that was pushed through in that 100 days would have taken a lot longer to get through. So there's something about the crisis creating opportunity, but then you need the person there to be able to diagnose and exploit that opportunity.
And what about the period of your most recent book, at the beginning of the 20th century, and Teddy Roosevelt? That's less understood, and the degree to which the country was deeply divided, and his part in the midst of that, and then ultimately how it resolved somehow. But are there reasonable comparisons between that period of time and today?
Well, sometimes when you hear the context of the turn of the 20th century, the rising gap between the rich and the poor, corporations having lots of power, people feeling like the middle class was squeezed, new technology making people... It was great. At the turn of the century, they worried about the speed of modern life, that somehow people were getting depressed because things had gotten too fast. And then I think about, my God, what about today? But the interesting thing is Teddy Roosevelt's one of the few presidents who is considered a great president, and he didn't have that extant crisis, but he saw the hidden dangers of that era in which he was living, where there was no workman's compensation, women and children were being exploited, and he was able to mobilize public sentiment. That's where the whole word bully pulpit came. It was his definition that the president has a power to preach to the country, and then the country can force or encourage the Congress to move. And he did actually do things that most people agreed upon, but it had just gotten stuck in the Congress being divided at that time. History tells you that when things seem intractable, though, we can make changes. I mean, that's why I love it so much. I mean, I think we're at a stage in the country in general, not just with racial relations, where we feel like our problems are so complicated we don't have power over them anymore, that there's not anything we can do as citizens. But everything I've learned in the progressive era, it was citizens that pushed Teddy Roosevelt and the reluctant Congress to do the legislation that was needed at the turn of the century. It was citizens that began the anti-slavery movement. It was citizens in the civil rights movement in the 60s.
I mean, you've watched President Obama pretty closely and have something of a relationship there. Have we heard too much from him, even though he is a very charismatic person in person?
I think the problem now, the bully pulpit, is less powerful than it once was. Not only do we hear too much, perhaps, and we see them too often, so their words don't have that special moment, but even when they give a major speech now, at least it used to be covered by 3 networks, and everybody pretty much would be watching it. Now you might be watching your favorite cable network. You'll only hear the part that they want you to hear. You may not hear the whole speech. You might hear the pundits, sometimes including myself, criticizing it before it's even done.
you probably played as large a role as any other writer or historian in terms of advancing the idea that understanding an important figure in history is about much more than just them, or the policies that they adopted, or the things that they did, but the spouse, the children, the larger context, the spouses and children of the other rivals, the other people who were there. And your books have been these rich social fabric histories around these figures. Yet, when we look at our contemporary leaders, there's really almost none of that. And in fact, and if there's anything, it's only snarky stuff on the margins. But we perceive these presidents in really narrow ways that perhaps don't really get at the things that you end up spending years of time trying to figure out.
You know, I hadn't really thought of that until you answered the question, until you asked the question. But I think that's right. I mean, I think when I think about what's combined all the books that I've written together, it's the importance of relationships. And you think about it in our own lives. That's key. It's not just wife and friends, but colleagues, the people you're working with. How do you form a team so that in a certain sense Lincoln's was a team that he was able to form out of these people who had all thought they should have been president instead of him, who looked down on him at the start and realized in the end that he was in a certain sense the chief of them all. FDR's relationship with Eleanor. Without Eleanor, he would not have been the president that he was. I mean, she was the moral figure, constantly arguing with him, constantly, being a pain, as he might say, but a great pain, and a thorn in his side. I guess that's the way he put it. And obviously, Teddy without Taft wouldn't have been the same, and Taft without Teddy. So that these people don't govern in isolation, and yet we do somehow, you're right, in the time when we look at them, we just see the guy in the White House. So far, just the guy in the White House. And they care about the wives, et cetera, and there's something on the kids. But what's more important is what kind of collegial relationships do they have with the people they're working with? We don't know a lot about that. And that teams thing is critical in business, in any organization, that I'd like to know more about, even at the time.
In terms of President Obama and these antecedents that may exist in history, it seems to me the conventional wisdom is that the team of rivals approach, while it's where he started, that it hasn't really played out the way that he might have imagined. In fact, it tends to be that the criticism of him oftentimes is more along the lines of being a micromanager, and then progressively more of one over the course of his presidency. At the same time, one of the things that you capture so well in Team of Rivals is that Lincoln wasn't just engaged in these relationships with the designated rivals, but he was orchestrating a much larger symphony. I mean, the degree to which he was reaching down to individual generals and individual people.
No, I do think that most of our successful presidents have had to reach below the cabinet level to get to that desk officer, in the State Department, or to get to the general below the general at that certain level. The other interesting thing your question reminds me of, though, is I think in these earlier days, our presidents were able to reach out to the public and absorb their feelings and their ideas in a deeper way. I mean, for example, Teddy Roosevelt went on these whistle-stop train tours. He'd be gone 6 weeks in the spring and 6 weeks in the fall, stopping at every station, listening to complaints, listening to what the people were feeling, even waving to them as he was going past them, and they were standing at little village stations. There's one moment when he was waving frantically, and he was kind of disappointed that he didn't seem to get a smile back until somebody told him he was waving at a herd of cows. He was rather nearsighted. But anyway, there was a sense in which you wish that our presidents today, they get stuck in Washington. They do go out for fundraisers, obviously. They go out and they have meetings with people, town halls. It's not the same as the everyday process where Lincoln saw ordinary people every morning. At that day before civil service, they came in and they wanted a job. And after a while, his secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, said, "Lincoln, you don't have time for these ordinary people." He said, "You're wrong. This is the popular assemblage out of which I have come. I must never forget that. These are my public opinion baths." And so there was a sense of constant connection to ordinary people. So too did the train trips that Teddy Roosevelt went on. And FDR was constantly having people into the White House all the time. No dinner without people that he could talk to, that could argue with him. You don't have the feeling that our modern presidents have moved outside the White House as much as these people did to really get a feeling for where the country's at.
When I say to a historian, how might Teddy Roosevelt have handled this, or what's the lesson from that thing in the past, past to deal with this thing in the present. And very oftentimes the historian will say, well, actually, I'm about the things in the past, and even the notion of lessons of history is disputed by people at times.
I'm actually thinking about this a lot right now because the work I'm doing is a book on leadership. I'm going to bring all my guys into the room at the same time and try and figure out, are there things we can learn from their leadership, even though the context was different? And obviously you have to set the context for each person because that changes the nature of the challenges that they've met, but they're all dealing with human nature. Leadership is about mobilizing people, it's about persuading people, it's about getting through obstacles. So there's no question in my mind that there are lessons to be learned from people who were leaders in the past.
Let's talk about you as a writer for a few minutes, and then we'll come back to some speculative history after that. But how did you become you?
Oh, a minor question, sir. I don't think I've ever been asked that in my life. I mean, I think if that means how did I come to love history, I mean, it partly has to do, there's no question, as I always come back to my father teaching me how to keep score when I was a little girl so that I could record for him the history of that Brooklyn Dodgers game. And, I think I learned the narrative art from those nicely sessions with my father, because at first I'd blurt out, after I had learned these miniaturized symbols, it was going to take 2 hours to tell him the story. The Dodgers won or the Dodgers lost, which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I finally learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end. Much later, read an essay by my heroine, Barbara Tuchman, who said, even if you're writing about a war, you have to imagine you do not know how that war ended, so you can carry a reader with you every step along the way, just knowing what the people at the time knew. So that's where that love of history came, even if it was just the history of the Dodger game 3 hours before. And then I had a teacher in high school, as is so often the truth, Miss Austin, and she won an award as the best history teacher in New York State. And then I went to some of the homes. My parents took me to FDR's home. I think there's nothing like seeing the homes of these people to feel like they're still alive. I remember when I was little seeing FDR's glasses on his desk and seeing his cigarette holder. And I said to this tour person, he's got to be alive. He left his glasses here. And then seeing Fowler's leash on the bed upstairs and thinking the little dog was still running around. And then I began to think, you could really write history as if they are still alive. My only fear is that someday there'll be a panel of all these presidents I've ever studied in the afterlife, and they'll all be telling me every single thing I got wrong. And the first person to scream out will be LBJ. How come that book on the Kennedys was twice as long as the book he wrote about me? But speaking of LBJ, how I became what I became, there's no question that experience of being a White House Fellow when I was 24 years old, working with LBJ, being with him on the ranch to help him on his memoirs, listening to him talk, having hours with him that I would never have had as a young person is what turned me into a presidential scholar. My PhD was in Supreme Court history. I might have been a Supreme Court historian, which would have been fine, but probably not as much fun as this has been.
But it's interesting to me how difficult it is for many people to embrace that something is important. There's just sort of there's a reluctance to take something really seriously. Even the visit of a presidential candidate, or why a Senate race is really important, or that principles really matter.
But the interesting thing is, when I was a young person, I probably didn't realize it as much at that moment. I remember sometimes when LBJ would want me to talk to him at night because he'd be lonely, and I had a date, and I'm thinking, do I really want to talk to this guy at night instead of going out on a date? And I think, thank God, most of the time I said, yes, I will. But your perspective is somewhat undone at that time. It was really later that I realized what a privilege it was, because he was vulnerable in those last years of his life. He knew that the war in Vietnam had cut his legacy in two, but he knew what he had accomplished in civil rights. We're getting it now. I mean, that's the thing that makes me sad. If only he'd lived long enough to see 50 years later that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and Medicare, I mean, he left his stamp on the country. But at that time, he was so sad that he spent hours talking to me that he never would have if I'd known him at the height of his power. So I just happened to be there, luckily. And it was perhaps that I was a young woman. It was perhaps that I was loving history. Whatever it was that allowed him to choose me to spend so many hours with. Sometimes I think it was just because I loved listening to his stories, and they were so incredibly interesting, even if I discovered later that half of them weren't true. So I think part of it was that he liked the fact that I liked listening to his tall tales. I also worried that part of it was that I was a young woman, but and one day he took me to the lake saying he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous because the lake was called Lake Lyndon Johnson, and we had wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic traffic, and I thought, oh my God, here it comes. And he started out Doris more than any other woman I've ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing, given what was going on in my mind.
Suddenly you realize you actually kind of did want him to be interested in you.
Right. I mean, this was terrible.
Was Abraham Lincoln born destined to be this spectacular figure, or was it those long nights reading the book in the light of the fire?
Well, I think thinking of Lincoln, it's really interesting because obviously there are traits that he's born with. Intelligence, with that artistic capacity, is probably an inborn trait. And what he's born with is ambition. This is the mystery. I'd love to know the answer to this. Where do we get our ambition from? Where is that drive? In Lincoln, it was huge. It was fierce. I mean, he's in this poor situation where he is. Most of the people don't read or write around him, and he's teaching himself to read. And then he becomes the only one in that community that can read, and that sets him above everybody else and makes him feel like maybe I have a chance to get out of this community. And then he desperately wants to get out, and he wants to become somebody. And he dreams even of making a difference in people's lives when he's a young man, before he has any chance of thinking, I can really do it. And even at the moment when he's in his early 30s and he's in a depression, and a suicidal depression, and his friends come to him and they take all knives and scissors away. And partly the depression is that the gap between those huge ambitions and where he is in his life seems like, I'll never get there. And they say, you have to rally or you'll die. And he said, I would just as soon die now, but I've not yet done anything to make any human being remember that I have lived. That's my dream. He tells that to his friend Joshua Speed at the time. And then years later, when he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, Speed comes to the White House. He said, well, finally, I think my dream has been realized. So where does that come from, that mysterious desire and drive that you want something in your life and you have the perseverance? So there are things that you can see that have formed them, but in some ways it's still going to be a mystery as to why somebody drives themselves to want to become one of these characters.
And how do you see any of our contemporary presidents in that same regard?
Well, I think that the question today is what it takes to run for the presidency may be different than what it takes to govern us now. I mean, it takes a certain understanding of the tactical skills of campaigning. It takes understanding caucuses, understanding how to raise funds, how to get money. And that drives a person. And then once they get there, are they still dreaming the same dreams that a Lincoln had? Maybe they are, but I think it's much harder to achieve those dreams. When we look at our recent presidents, I mean, it's a complicated thing, but again, I'm going to go back to that optimism of earlier on. Just because things seem tough right now and it seems like nobody can get anything done in Congress and they can't agree with one another, and who would ever want to be a congressman or a senator today when they're not accomplishing something they can possibly tell their grandchildren, I was there when that civil rights bill passed? And yet, this fever will break. Something's going to happen. I got to believe that the country will start dealing with its problems again, as we have before. But still, I think maybe, I haven't seen recent presidents since Clinton, that you've seen a real joy in the process of being president, that natural politician thing. People feel that, and they want that in their leader, I think.
And why do you think it is that, for instance, say with a President Obama, that here you have a figure that is elected in a fairly resounding way originally, what does indeed appear to be a tremendous mandate, all sorts of people voting for him who were not logical to have voted for him at that particular moment in time, great sense of national accomplishment around this that was somewhat distinct from him, I think, but that day on the Mall, the day of the inauguration, there was 1 million people out there. And yet, in just like what seemed to be the blink of an eye, this was a president who was in distress and under attack, even sort of before anything had happened. I mean, does that say something about the a schizophrenic quality of the American people? And is that a new thing, if that's the case?
Well, there certainly was. I think you're right. And you've probably thought about this more than I, but there was a sense that America felt good about itself in electing its first African-American president, as I hope someday they'll feel good about themselves electing their first woman president. So that there was a sense in which this was an accomplishment in itself. And maybe it was apart from Obama and how, as you suggest in your question, how they actually felt about this person, although this person did seem to be somebody on whom we could all project a liking during that campaign and a feeling good about ourselves, that we had moved beyond some of our racial prejudices. Probably those prejudices still remain, as we've seen in these last years, and they're going to take a lot more time and energy to still come to the surface and be dealt with. And the election itself didn't do what we might have hoped it would have done in terms of ending that racial divide, as we're seeing so sadly right now. So it's a complicated question, but I think there will be, when history looks back, the fact that the first African American was elected will be a moment in history, no matter what, and a good moment.
How do you react to the oft-made assertion that things are more toxic in our politics today than ever, that it's nastier and dirtier and crueler than at any point in the past?
I'll tell you, I think in my lifetime, I won't go back to the revolvers on the floor in the Senate in the 1850s, because I agree with what you're saying. In my lifetime, it's more toxic than I've seen it, and I think there are some reasons for that. I mean, even during LBJ's time, so we're talking 50 years ago, the congressmen and senators used to stay in Washington on the weekends. They weren't racing home to get funds for their campaigns, for these increasingly escalating costs of campaigns, which I still think is the poison in the system today. They formed friendships across party lines. They played poker together. They drank together. So when Johnson needed to get Dirksen, the Republican minority leader, to go with him on civil rights, they had a friendship that he could build upon. Things weren't as transparent then. He could offer him all sorts of things, dams, public works projects, bridges. That would be impossible today, right? And he could also offer him, more importantly, Everett, you come with me on this bill. You bring some Republicans to break the Southern filibuster. And 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? But there was a camaraderie. There was a sense of institutional patriotism. There was a sense in which they felt, they in Congress and in the Senate, this is where we are. Now they all want to run for president. They can't wait to get out of where they are. They're spending so much time raising funds. They have those structural problems with redistricting where they don't have to be moderate. And the cable networks doesn't help, and people are on the television if they're more extreme. The way the primary system is run produces that extremity. I think it's worse now than in my lifetime.
If you were having dinner with President Obama next week, and he said, Doris, give me 3 bullet points, 4 bullet points, what do I do so that the you of 20, 30, 40 years from now looks back on me in a good way? What would your advice to him be?
Well, I think one of the things is to not lose energy. I mean, one of the things LBJ told his staff in those last couple of years is, I don't want to see a single resume on anybody's desk. I don't want you thinking of where you're going. We still got time. So I think the most important thing is to not feel that constriction of time, which I think you begin to feel when you see everybody else turning their attention to the next campaign. There's still time for foreign affairs. There's time for domestic stuff. There's time for thinking about climate, which he is talking about. There's time to deal with this racial issue. Who is better adept, possibly, at dealing with it, which has reared its head yet once again? So I think that the important thing is to just keep your energy going and think about what you came into the presidency for in the first place.
You said a moment ago that President Obama, having been the first black president, on that basis alone, I think what you said was, that's an important thing, no matter what, that's going to be an important thing. His advocates would say, first black president, passage of national health care legislation after 50 years of discussion about it, that just on the basis of those two things, I think you could also throw in that what were probably the right decisions at the very beginning of his presidency, along with President Bush, in terms of the financial crisis. His advocates would say, once all of the noise has settled away, that adds up to a great presidency, despite all the other things.
I think it will look more consequential in the future than it does now. And that's partly because of what you said before. We're just so in the middle of criticizing perhaps what we feel about his leadership, or the things that we wish were different about him, or his relationship with the press, or his inability to get Congress to do something. And it'll be 30 years from now that they'll look back and see what actually happened during that period of 8 years. And more probably did happen than we might be feeling right now, because it seems like the recession may have come to an end, or maybe coming out of it. So maybe the stimulus did do something at the beginning, or some of those decisions that were made. Healthcare did get passed. It'll be important to see whether it sustains itself. If it got repealed, that would make a huge difference to his legacy. But if it becomes something like Medicare, then he will be given credit for that, and being the first African American president. Yeah, I think we're really hard pressed to evaluate these people in the middle of them all right now. Maybe we could never have. Look, if FDR hadn't run for a third term and he had been stopped in 1939, 1940, he would have been the president who didn't end the Depression, right? And instead, now he gets that second chance, just what we've been talking about, terrible chance to be the Allied head of World War II, the most terrible war in human history, and yet it gives him a legacy that he would not have had.
It's been a real pleasure having you.
Pleasure for me to be with you.
Thanks for being here. Pulitzer Prize winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin. For more about this book and this program, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. See you next time.